Okay, Alice. So I'm going to give you the floor for 20 minutes, and then and Jesus will be your discussant. And Jesus is there. Okay, perfect. Okay,
So we
it's
share
up to you,
the
Alice.
screen. Thank
Yes,
you.
please share your screen.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to put a full screen view. All right, so thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you to all the organizers of this conference to give me this opportunity to present a work in progress with Emmanuel Auriol from the Toulouse School of Economics, and with Stéphanie Perrault, who is a very strong PhD candidate from University of Montreal, and as well a great research collaborator. So to motivate my talk, perhaps this picture speaks by itself. So, but as well, But as well, what we know is that every year more than 2.5 million people are smuggled around the world. And this brings billions of revenue into the hands of criminal networks. And as well, there is a general call on countries to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration, are set in the SDG goal for 2030, the target. So the question in this paper is, can we put an end to human smuggling and at the same time regulate economic migration flows? So on this question, in fact, there is a growing literature that deals with the issue of missing migration markets. So in fact, given very large economic gains for workers to migrate to high wages countries, the fact that there are really strict barriers to international migration does in fact give huge incentives for illegal migration. And there have been several policy proposals that have been discussed by economists such as Baker. We try to implement or to find solutions to create legal markets. So for example, the proposal, which is probably the most debated, the idea to auction immigration visa in order to regulate migration flows has lots of advantages. And among those obvious advantages, it brings revenue to the host countries, so it can as well be kind of attractive for the resident citizens. However, given the fact that those visa on auctions are likely to be limited in number and as well in their type, this will leave room for smugglers to operate. And in particular, it is likely that they may be able to propose at lower cost their services, in particular to low-skilled workers or to poorer workers who may not be able to afford those or to bid for those auctions. So, in fact, our paper precisely tries to address this issue. So it tries to propose to set up a scheme of temporary visa, which specifically to feed low-paid jobs, to recruit workers for low-paid jobs. And they are designed with this idea that we shall try to throttle the smugglers' activities. So we will take into account the response by smugglers to the policy and set up the price at the visa in order to attract workers in low-paid jobs. So we will find that the low-price visa under our scheme will be good at attracting some low-skilled workers, and through this policy, we can also regulate the migration flows. All right, so an advantage of this system as compared to other proposals is that it relies on existing legal frameworks, and from this viewpoint may be doable. Okay, in particular, there have been very large systems of temporary foreign worker permits that have been implemented in many countries and are still current in Canada, for example, or in Cyprus, and are massively used in Southeast Asian countries, which fuel their economies through this system. So also this has been often very much criticized by scholars in law or by sociologists or in social sciences. They have been analyzed for their workability by economists such as Dragic and Vinogradova. And what here we will add to this literature is how to design those visas in order to drive the smugglers out of business and weaken the human smuggling activities. So the presentation will be first to set up a framework to present a smuggling market, so what we will call the status quo, where those workers have no means to migrate apart from using the smugglers' services. And then introduce a temporary visa scheme, and we will see what are the constraints that a government faces in order to press out the smugglers of this market. And then we will turn to the results, and if we have time, to quantify the implications it will have in terms of the price of visa and the flows of legal migrants following the introduction of such schemes. So this market, so we will use to model the supply a very standard framework, which is that when the smugglers operate, in fact, they maximize their profits and they compete à la Cournot. So the price they will charge will be an increasing function of their marginal cost to operate, the negative function of the number of competitors on the market, and they will decrease in the price elasticity of demand. Okay, so now the demand. So we will assume that workers are heterogeneous with respect to their skills, and we will model their behavior as being either rational, so following the standard expected utility theory framework, but we will also show that, in fact, we will derive most of our results on the cumulative prospect theory, which allows to give them some behavioral traits. In particular, we think it is suitable for those very poor migrants who take huge risk to migrate. And following this the theory, so we can, for example, model the decision to migrate of workers. So in case they migrate, they face a lottery, which with a probability 1 minus q, they might succeed in their migration using the smuggler services. In this case, they will be hired in the foreign country, but in the illegal sector. So they will be paid with a discount factor at the minimum wage in the host country. And they will have paid the smuggler fees PI. If they do not succeed with probability Q, then what we assume is that they return to their home country or they are pushed back, and they will be paid and they will have an income which will here depend on the wage in the home country and as well on their skill level. So they are returned to skill at home, but not in the foreign country. And if they fail, they lose their sunk cost that they have paid to the smugglers. So they compare this to take their decision to migrate to what if they stay at home. And this modeling will simply show that there is a negative selection through this migration. So only the workers with low skill level below this threshold theta I will be willing to migrate illegally. Okay, so selection comes from the fact that there are no returns to skill if they migrate illegally in. So now what an interesting thing is that this threshold will be, of course, decreasing in the price of the smuggling, okay, and decreasing in the risk they face, and increasing in the wage differential, which is very intuitive. So the migration demand will increase as there are more prospects to migrate and decrease when there are fewer prospects. So now what happens if you introduce the temporary visa scheme we have in mind? So what will be the policy is that the government wants to sell temporary visa at price PL of duration tau, and this is to recruit workers in low-paid jobs. Okay, so the government commits to its policy, And then the smugglers will react to the policy and will try to attract some migrants by lowering their price. So they will charge a response price, PI, which will depend on the visa price and on the attribute of the visa price. So it will in fact decrease, we will see, okay, in the legal visa price. Sorry, it will be pushed back. So what we will in fact resolve is these games by backward induction. So we will then determine the policy of the government. So the government will propose a visa at a price which will push back, which will drive the smugglers out of market, which we'll call the eviction price. So what constraints does the government face? So first of all, it has to incentivize some workers to take up these low-skilled jobs and migrate legally rather than stay home, which is the individual rationality constraint. So this will determine, so by looking at comparing the gains of the workers if he migrates legally through the scheme or if he stays home, you can find again that you have a negative selection legal migration demand. So why? It is because once again, those workers, if they migrate, okay, they will in fact spend a bit of time in the foreign country for low-paid jobs. So they will have no returns to their skills there. Okay, whereas if they stay home, they spend more time where they have returns to their skill. So the legal migration demand will come from this lower end of the skill distribution. And then the second constraint is so that some workers prefer to migrate legally through the scheme rather than illegally. So the incentive compatible constraints. And again, we can compare the lottery in case a worker migrates legally with the gains if he migrates legally through the scheme. And this determines this threshold. And what we will find is that the very low end of the skill distribution will characterize the workers who will prefer to migrate legally than legally. Okay, so here this would be because the illegal workers, they will spend more time in the foreign country with no return to their skill as compared to the legal workers who will come back at some point to the home country and have some returns. So this determines this threshold skill, theta Li, and very importantly, we can show very generally that this threshold, in fact, can be pushed down if either you increase the duration of the visa, okay, or if you increase the price of migration or the risk to migrate illegally, okay, and similarly, if you decrease the visa price, the eviction price proposed by the government is going back to push down this threshold. So you're going to throttle or to dry up the market for illegal workers. Okay, so the third constraint that needs to be satisfied to manage to sell those legal visas to the workers is as well to incentivize them to return to their home country after the visa expires and not to overstay in the foreign country where they have high wage as compared to their home country. So there are several ways to do that. And in fact, countries who have this temporary guest worker system use a combination of instruments. And in particular, for example, they may retain a share of the income earned abroad on a bank account. And here we might think that we can do that and give an interest rate when the worker returns to the home countries to be fair. And as well, they may increase the risk of deportation, which will give as well further incentive for workers to comply with the rules of the visa scheme. So we can show, and it is done in proposition 1, that it can always be enforceable. So if you can increase high enough the deportation rate or the income retention rates, you will always be able to incentivize those workers to return home. The problem is that it's a theoretical proposition, and whether it's feasible in practice or in law, that might be more of a problem. We'll discuss that. So then after we satisfy all these constraints, okay, So the government needs to take into account that the smugglers will respond to the policy. And so again, by modeling the supply, we can determine what is the price, the response by smuggler to the policy, okay? And the government will set the price of the visa at such a level that after smugglers respond to the policy, the smugglers will no longer be able to make positive profits, okay, given the price of the visa proposed by the government. Okay, so we can resolve this, and this will in fact determine the eviction price, the maximum eviction price of the visa, okay, that will drive the smugglers out of business. And of course, in fact, it's a menu of price because it will depend on the duration of the visa. So it depends on your objectives. So let's now go to the results. So we can show generally that this eviction price of visa is increasing with the visa duration, which is quite intuitive because it increases the relative value of migrating legally as compared to illegally. So you can more easily compete with the smugglers. And similarly, it increases with the level of enforcement of the external and internal controls. So this means here that the government has at least 3 types of instruments in order to regulate the flow of temporary workers. And for example, he may have a target in the number of desirable workers in the economy, and then he will minimize the cost, okay, by determining the optimal level of external and internal controls, okay, to reach this target. So you can use the model in this manner if you know everything about the cost of enforcement. So I'm going to go now very quickly to the numerical applications, which here are quite hazardous and is done on the very rare information we could get on the smuggling market, which we need in order to set the eviction price of the visa. So in particular, we are going to look at 2 routes. So the routes of the Senegalese workers to France or to Spain, because we have this very, very interesting information from a study by Mbaye, who has surveyed the migrants before they leave Senegal, so in Dakar in 2007 and 2008, and has got a lot of information, in particular, on the price they are paying in order to cross the sea to go to France or to Spain. And so the price are around 2,000 euros for France and lower for Spain. So interestingly as well, she quotes this study by Mbo and Tamba, which in fact gives an estimate of the marginal cost for the smugglers to operate. So the captain of the dinghies that are used by these illegal migrants reports that they pay on average per head of migrants on board around less than 1,000 euros for Spain and more to France. Okay, so we use information and then use our model to estimate what would be the maximum eviction price, okay, which will increase with the duration of the visa. So if you go from 3 years to 6 years, you can compute the eviction price that allows to push the smugglers out of business. And it will also increase with the risk of crossing illegally, which is a theoretical results we have in our model. So we can then compute what would be the legal demand following the scheme. And we can see that the demand can, okay, for low visa price, so the eviction price can be, needs to be lower, obviously. And then in this case, the demand increases a little bit, but then if you increase the duration of the visa or you increase the risk, you can even have negative decrease in the demand following this legalization scheme. Okay, and of course, you might think that those visa prices are too high for poor workers involved, and the government can also decide to put visa eviction price that are below the maximum eviction price and sell the visa, for example, let's say at 4,000 euros, which correspond to the embassy price. So for those illegal who use fake passports to cross with the smugglers, they pay around 4,000 euros. And you can then compute if you use this scheme, okay, the price of visa at around 4,000 euros, what would be the increase following the introduction of the scheme in the legal demand? And note that here you don't have any illegal demand anymore. So the increase in demand would be around 13% in this case, if the, okay. And I need to stop here. So this shows that you can, okay, I'll stop here. You can, in fact, regulate the migration flows and even further because they migrate temporarily as opposed to longer if they migrate illegally. So I'm conclude here. So you can show that you no longer have a policy trade-off through this visa scheme. You can both legalize and regulate the flows. But then what it shows as well, which I did not have time to show in the numerical application, is that the self-enforceability may be a strong constraint, and especially for south-north migration, where the wage differential is very, very high. So this is, in fact, very important to stress that to regulate and legalize, you need a very important policy mix where you need to use different types of instruments. So the seller visa plus a lot of enforcement for this to be workable. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you very much for complying with the time limit. So now I'm going to give the floor to Jesus, who is going to discuss the paper.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michel. I hope that everybody can hear me, and otherwise let me know, please. So let me share the presentation that I prepared, if I can. And just let me start by saying that I really enjoyed this this presentation. That I'm having trouble sharing.
We don't see your discussion, Jesus. We see your face.
Okay, and sorry about that. Sorry for making you see my face. So what I wanted to do is share the presentation. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I think Alice did a great job explaining her paper, of course, and she also did a great job during the presentation. So basically what you saw during the presentation is very similar to the experience that I had reading the paper. I don't need to summarize what she's doing here. She has this model in which a government can sell temporary visas. She calibrates the model to Senegalese immigration to Spain and France. And one part that she didn't discuss much during the presentation was the part of optimal policies, in which she works both with the duration of the visas and with different types of expenditure on domestic and external enforcement. So I have very few comments on the model. The results are ordered in three different propositions. She didn't explain all of them. So the first one is very reminiscent of the result by Ethier. You have that domestic enforcement can be a key for an optimal policy mix. If I have to ask for something in this proposition would be to for them to be a little bit more clear on how many of these parameters you would need to change in terms of the domestic or external enforcement. In proposition 2, I mean, the question that comes to mind is why would we want to evict smugglers? Whether we would like to have some other type of policy mix. She did a little bit of this in the calibration, and then she went to the optimal policies in proposition 4. And then the proposition 3 is about the duration of the visa and skill of the migrants, where shorter schemes lead to more selected migrants. To me, I find this interesting, but this follows very directly from the assumptions on returns that she explained very well during her presentation. And then the question that comes to mind is if you have different assumptions on returns, in particular, if you allow that the wages at destination vary with ability, would you have different patterns of selection of migrants coming out? So I suspect that would be the case, but it would be interesting to look a little bit more into this. So that would be on the model. On the optimal policies, let me go directly, in the interest of time, to the main point that I would like to do is what she does here in this part of the paper is to minimize the expenditures. So there are 3 different types of expenditures that the government can do. The government can try to increase smugglers' costs. The government can try to decrease illegal migrant earnings, or increase the probability of crossing failures. Okay, so the issue here is that the objective of the government is to completely minimize this level of expenditure to attain a given number of workers. Okay, so we are never told what is the optimal number of workers that the government should allow in. I understand that this is a difficult question, but at least thinking about endogenizing this number of workers could be interesting. And then relax a little bit more the assumption in this part of the optimal policies of the eviction of the smugglers. So maybe we have a policy mix in which we don't, as a government, we may not be interested in evicting the smugglers. So I would be interested to see what happens in that case. Then comments on the calibration. So this is the part of the paper. So she's, rather than using expected utility theory, as she explained, she's using cumulative prospect theory to model the attitude of the migrants toward risk. The part where this matters most is on the calibration, and I didn't see an effect of the impact of this assumption here, and I think that would be interesting. And then just alternative data sources to calibrate. There might be some better data on Senegalese migration to Spain. There was a survey of immigrants in Spain. I don't know if there would be enough observations for Senegalese. I know there are enough observations for other country groups, so I'm not completely sure about this. Mm-hmm. Then I don't know if you are familiar with this MAFE project, which is like the Mexican migration project, but for Senegalese and other African countries. And maybe this is the type of data set that could be adjusted exactly to the type of question that you're doing here. And if I have the time, Michelle, stop me if I'm going too far. More general questions that I would like to be addressed in the paper. So we see a model to see what's under which conditions, or what are how could the sale of visas work to eliminate the smuggling and to minimize costs. So the model is particularly fit to this proposal, and this makes sense. But I feel that it does not engage with alternative proposals or with existing systems. So you do that verbally in the, I think there is section 2 and in the introduction. But I would like to see this a little bit formally, at least for some of the policies or for the existing policies, like existing temporary visas schemes. So how would they fit into your framework? And in particular, since we are talking here about using prices, would there be here an equivalence between quotas and prices in this setting, or there is something different about a typical guest worker programs with respect in your model that differentiates it from the sale of visas? And then one last point. So why these type of schemes are not unpopular? There are some reasons that are advancing the test, but I maybe would like to see this related to this repugnant markets idea, and why there is such an opposition to make migrants pay for visas. So overall, great paper, and thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to discuss it.
Thank you very much, Jesus, for this nice discussion. So maybe what I will propose is that Alice maybe takes 1 or 2 questions. Alice, there is one question. Do you have is the paper available somewhere? Maybe you can.
Okay. Okay.
People that ask me. Anyway,
this question is an easy one to answer, so I will pick it up straight. The paper is, we have a version, so I'm happy to give it by email to you. The reason why I did not put it online is that we have been changing it a lot in the last weeks, and there will be lots of changes. I did not want to circulate it as it is already finished. It's very much in progress, and I think Jesus was very nice because he read the last draft of the paper, but big parts are in constant changes. So I'm happy to send people by email the version knowing that it's not yet ready to be circulated. So that's, but there is, yeah, it's written, but we don't think it's nice enough to circulate it at the moment.
Okay. Do you want
Okay.
just to reply to maybe the main point of Jesus, because we are running out of time? So
which one is it? Because there were many very interesting points. And thank you very much, Jesus. That's fantastic to have your comments and as well your suggestions about the surveys, because we are dramatically lacking data for this type of topics. So I'm going to look into all your suggestions. And then which is the main point that maybe it's about optimal policies or what, which main point?
If I had to
What
choose,
you
I would go with the last question, like the equivalence between the visas and prices and quotas in this setting.
So I'm not sure. So what I wanted to say is that one difficulty with any policy that establish quota is that as soon as you establish a quota, or okay, in any type, you will have a smuggling market, because there will be not enough. I mean, whether it's through an auctioning system or very simple guest worker system with a number of visas that are given, you may expect that it will be insufficient to cover all the needs. And this is why it is important to go through this response by the smugglers and to try to evict them and to throttle them by using a combination of instruments. So this is why our policy is quite different. That's something surely you understood. I'm not sure that completely answered your question, but so that there is something very important is to we go to this policy of eviction price. And now this is true that you could have a larger set of objectives, and the objective may not be to complete. We started so as well.
okay,
Try to enlarge the so, and it's not clear that you necessarily want to evict all the smugglers. There is a, but thanks anyway. So we are going to maybe enlarge the policy goals and.
Okay, thank you, Alice. We lost you for the last minute. I think the very last. Okay, so I agree, guys. I know that if you have questions, but I am acting as the chairman under the strong authority of Valar, so I have to comply with the rules of the World Bank and to keep the timing. So I think that we should move to the second presentation of Alexander, and this will be followed by a discussion of Giovanni. Okay, you've got the floor, please.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm experiencing difficulties with the connection for some reason. Okay, so my name is Alexander Kustov, and I'm postdoctoral associate in political economy at Yale University. Okay, can you see my screen?
So we can.
Okay, great. So yeah, so before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I was originally selected to present a different paper where I basically show that a lot of people around the world not just oppose immigration, they oppose emigration. And what's more interesting is that these are largely the same people, which, you know, is not in line with a lot of kind of political economy explanations of why people oppose immigration to begin with. So anyways, just if you were interested in this paper or if you're interested now, check it out. It's called Bloomery Planted. It's published in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. And yeah, just Google it. Okay, so for this paper, which I think actually is more in line with the panel here today, I'm looking at the common immigration backlash argument, and the idea is that voters can negatively respond to significant pro-immigration reforms and vote populist, and which can be counterproductive. And I should say that this is a part of the larger set of projects that I have, where I look at under what conditions most people in rich democracies would be willing to accept more open immigration policies. Okay, so let me start with I think like a very nice illustration of what I'm talking about. So in one of her post-election interviews, Hillary Clinton, an evidently very kind of pro-immigration politician, has remarked that basically European countries might want to consider to restrict their immigration further in order to stop kind of the right-wing populist wave, and the idea that kind of immigration, whether it was in the form of refugee crisis or even before that, has kind of laid down the conditions for Brexit and Trump and so on. And the reason why I thought it was interesting is because Clinton obviously is a politician, but she's one who notoriously kind of admitted in one of her private talks to Goldman Sachs that her dream was of open borders for human movement and the borderless world. So it's interesting that even a person who is kind of so notoriously pro-immigration would kind of think about immigration as something that can potentially be counterproductive. And it's not just Hillary Clinton. Actually, if you think about it, a lot of kind of otherwise pro-immigration authors and scholars, across the political spectrum, might kind of have some, pragmatic worries about the kind of political effects of immigration that might be eventually counterproductive. So the question that I'm asking in this paper is whether, significant pro-immigration reforms can in fact cause so-called populist backlash, and can they increase the share of populist vote or even xenophobia in the electorate. And to just give you a quick overview, so what I do here is that I provide some regional time series cross-sectional evidence where I link the best available public opinion and policy data across the last 40 years in European countries, and then estimate the impact of policy and voter behavior by exploiting the timing of major immigration reforms. And just to give you a quick preview, I find very little evidence of so-called backlash. So if we kind of look naively on just like cross-sectional correlations in the pool data, we can see that, kind of pro-immigration policy and reforms are kind of positively associated with populist voting across countries. But then if we take into account, time and covariates, it fixed effects, come up with some kind of more complex modeling strategies, we don't really see this kind of robust effects at all. Actually, if anything, it's the opposite. And I'm going to talk more about it in the presentation. So what is a backlash? So what I mean by backlash here is basically any adverse reaction to an advancement of disadvantaged social groups such as immigrants by a significant segment of the population and voters that may be counterproductive. And this last part is actually very important, the counterproductive part, because if we just use the word backlash as a synonym for any opposition, it's kind of trivial, not interesting, because obviously in a large country, any kind of policy or advancement can be opposed by a certain group of the population. So it's not really interesting. And here kind of this adverse reaction relates to, again, the kind of the changes in public attitudes and behaviors toward these disadvantaged groups and related policies. And what is also important is that when we talk about this kind of advancement being counterproductive, it's exactly to this adverse reaction to it, right? So when it comes to immigration, basically the idea is that no matter whether immigration is actually economically good for the receiving or the sending countries or the immigrants themselves, it can be counterproductive because of this kind of political effect in terms of increasing populism, for instance. Yeah, and so kind of throughout history, we can think of this kind of backlash arguments along these lines, applying to a great variety of causes, from kind of slavery abolition to most recently same-sex marriage. And obviously we can also think of why these arguments have been kind of empirically mistaken, and sometimes we can also think that they can be strategically employed by the opponents of the cause to kind of further undermine it. But I think what's interesting here is that, once we kind of specify the outcomes that we're interested in and the time frame that is, relevant, that we can actually empirically test those arguments. Yeah. So when it comes to immigration, I would like to differentiate between kind of a weaker and a less extreme version of this claim and a more extreme one. So in the kind of less extreme version of the argument, the idea is that significant pro-immigration reforms, they just simply raise the opportunities for political entrepreneurs to rally against immigration due to the fact of the rising salience of the issue. And it just, it's in the media, and there are a lot of anti-immigration voters, and, and they're more likely to vote populist because of that. And then this populists, when they come to power, they can also kind of impose subsequent restriction. That's why it's counterproductive. In the stronger version of the argument, which is also sometimes can be referred as a kind of thermostatic theory of public opinion, the idea is that when you have a significant pro-immigration reform, that can actually not just, indirectly increase the probability of populism, but also just kind of change the underlying preferences in the electorate by making people more anti-immigration. So another thing that I want to do before I kind of move on to the data and the analysis is just to differentiate between the backlash to immigrants themselves and their presence and the policy. So I feel like there's a lot of research in both economics and political science in terms of like the backlash to, the immigration flows and stocks, right? I would say my assessment of this literature is that the evidence has been mixed. So there can be some backlash, some reaction, but it's kind of very context specific. So there are a lot of really cool studies with good identification strategy when it comes to the effects of, refugee allocation and the refugee crisis. But, obviously the external validity of those can be limited. But I would say that regardless of what you think about the demographic effects and demographic change, this kind of focus on demography can be misplaced or at least incomplete, since, immigration presence is obviously kind of neither necessary nor sufficient for backlash. So, just to give you like very kind of simple example, if a certain country, which let's say in a downturn economy, like nobody wants to immigrate there, but then they just like, for whatever reason, the government declares fully open borders, right? So this can cause backlash regardless of whether actually anyone immigrates there, just because, voters can be upset with, the legitimacy, the other kind of things that are not just in terms of like the consequences or the expected arrival of immigrants. And I kind of elaborate on that in the paper, but the idea is that there can be something in addition and beyond just the, the immigrant numbers. And in fact, if you look at the related literature and backlash to, let's say, same-sex marriage and kind of advances in racial equality, there is this kind of recognition of the idea that the government laws themselves affect voter preferences. They don't just merely reflect the electorate, right, and the median voter, but they can also kind of shape the legitimation or the resistance for certain policies, right? But then the extent to which immigration policy itself affects voters has been, again, largely overlooked in the literature. Yeah, so here's a very simple causal diagram. So obviously there are a lot of kind of causal relationship and feedback loops that I'm not really considering in this paper. The first of this paper, I'm just basically looking at this kind of third stage relationship between immigration policy and immigration attitudes and, kind of voter behavior. So in terms of like preferences, salience, and the actual voting outcomes and as independent. All right, so in terms of the data, so what I did is that I created an original time series cross-sectional data set linking, again, public opinion, voter behavior, and policy data at the level of country years in 24 European countries. So as my main kind of independent variables, I'm looking at this new immigration policy indices that just came out over the last several years. So I'm mostly relying on IMPIC, which fruitfully kind of allows us to compare the openness of immigration policy across different countries and years. So I just want to mention that I'm focusing on labor and family migration in particular. So I'm not talking about humanitarian migration, refugees, illegal immigration, and so on and so forth, because I feel like all of these things are in large, kind of contingent on how open is just the general kind of labor and family migration is for different people, and kind of elaborate on the reasons for that in my paper. But I just want to mention that. And then I also look at the not just the general levels of immigration policy and its openness, but also the shocks and the reforms to the system on the annual level, right? So for that, I'm just, take the first differences of the IMPIC index that I'm using in the first independent variable. And I'm also relying on the different data set, which is called demic policy, which is more popular among demographers. Here, it just this kind of data set just basically codes all legislation that have been passed in a certain country in a certain year, and whether it was pro-immigration or an anti-immigration direction. So since it's a relative measure, it doesn't really allow us to compare the absolute level of openness across countries. But in terms, since we are interested in the effects of shocks, this can be kind of good for our purposes here. So these measures, they correlate positively, which is good, but not that much. There are many reasons for that, but just for the purpose of this paper, I use them as interchangeable. And when it comes to dependent variables, I'm looking at, just the share of populist vote in the electorate for the major, national legislatures and immigration attitudes, including both kind of preferences in terms of how restrictive immigration preferences are in the electorate, and then the salience of this preference and how important immigration is to voters compared to other issues, such as the economy, employment, and so on and so forth. And so in terms of methods, I'm, just do very simple kind of linear regression on country year data with country fixed effects and robust standard errors. So obviously there are many possibilities for reverse causality and, omitted variable bias, but most prominently you can think of, just populists coming to power and restricting immigration, or let's say policymakers enacting pro-immigration reforms strategically when, voters are more favorable toward them. So there are like things, that can be contested here, but then that's why I'm also running a bunch of additional specification with, lag-dependent variables, a bunch of placebo tests and election timing, which kind of takes into account some of this, problems. So just in terms of, the general idea of backlash and how realistic it is, if we just look at the, the aggregated time series, kind of makes sense. So basically over the last 40 years, we know that the populist vote have increased and also immigration policy has opened. Obviously, it doesn't mean anything. You can also add like, inequality lines there, whatever. It's, it's really hard to make any sense of it, but, it's something that, a picture that often used by, politicians themselves or, popular media, just to kind of show that, with the increase of immigration openness, we have experienced more populist. So it's kind of gives some kind of credibility to this idea to begin with across country. But obviously, if we kind of look within countries, some of these trends might disappear. But even if we kind of do like a very simple pooled cross, sectional correlation, we also see a positive relationship. So basically, in countries and years where immigration has been more open, we also see more populism. And I think more importantly, if we look at the kind of first differences, right? So at their, very basic scatter plot of, the annual changes in populist vote and the annual changes in immigration openness, we see that this positive relationship is still there, right? So obviously it's not strong, it's kind of noisy, but it's, you can clearly see here that, for instance, in almost none of the cases where there was a significant opening of immigration, we saw a decrease in populist vote, and conversely, in almost none of the cases where we saw a decrease in immigration openness, we saw an increase in populist vote. So it kind of, gives you an idea that, whatever people claim about immigration backlash can be indeed possible. All right.
5
But
minutes, Max, please. 5 minutes.
Okay.
5
Okay.
minutes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm almost done. Yeah. So. And, but what happens when we add country fixed effects, year fixed effects, other things? And when you look at this relation, basically none of the relationship are, neither substantively nor statistically significant. So not, if you look at the absolute level of immigration openness or, the kind of relative changes or pro-immigration reforms, none of this matters for populism. And these kind of null effects, they hold pretty robustly across all specifications. So if we add like lag-dependent variable, when we look at election years only, when we kind of disaggregate our independent variable, none of this really matters. When it comes to immigration preferences and whether, how people feel about, immigration restrictiveness, also you really don't see much. If anything, actually, there is a positive relationship. So here, immigration preferences are quoted, as anti-immigration preference. So actually, this relationship is positive, so that basically the openness of immigration policy is positively related to the openness of immigration preferences. And what's even more important here is that this relationship holds even if we include lag-dependent variable and also we send placebo tests. So if we do the same thing with, let's say, welfare preferences, economic preferences, of other sorts, we don't really see any relationship at all. I would still be I would not be comfortable claiming any causal relationship here. So again, as I mentioned, it's possible that policymakers they enact pro-immigration reforms when voters are more positives in terms of representation, but it's very clear that this negative are probably not there. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I said. And just again to conclude, right? So according to the best social science evidence, by the people, collected by the people at this conference, Michael Clemens et al. Yeah, so we know that the benefits of free migration significantly outweigh any of its possible costs, right? But many people and scholars, I should say, still have this reasonable worries about the fact that any major reform can be counterproductive and faces significant voter backlash and lead to more populism and more restrictions later on. So my results strongly indicate that this past pro-immigration reforms that we had, at least in Europe, have not really increased populism or xenophobia. And quite equivalently, it means that actually additional restrictions when countries have restricted immigration, and which has actually happened quite a few times, also have not been related to lower populism or xenophobia. So in general, despite this indigeneity issues, the evidence is not in line with the common claim that immigration advancements have been counterproductive. Yeah, and just in terms of the next step, I'm currently working on expanding the data set that I'm having to include more countries and also coding the precise timing of major reforms to better address endogeneity issues. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, and also to comply with the time limit. So now I'm going to give the floor to Giovanni for a 5-minute discussion. Please, Giovanni. All right, Giovanni, go ahead, please.
I think you're muted.
You are muted. You are muted. So you need to unmute your micro. The left-hand side button on your screen.
Amen.
Good, thank you.
Have you unmuted me?
Yes.
Can you see the discussion?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very interesting paper. Apologies for the technological challenges. All right, so let me start with a short summary of the paper. This is a very interesting paper that tackles a very relevant policy question, namely whether a more open immigration policy fosters greater opposition to immigration and support for populist parties. As Alex was pointing out, the question is studied essentially using a panel dataset covering 24 European countries, spanning basically the period between 1980 and 2014. The main dependent variables are, on the one hand, the Timbro Authoritarian Populism Index, and the other main variable used in the analysis is an index of immigration conservatism put together by Caffey and his co-authors, which is based on the aggregation of major public opinion survey questions. When it comes to the main explanatory variables of interest, are two of the indexes of migration policies which have been collected recently. The IMPIC index allows comparison across countries, The DEMIG index codes instead migration policy changes, so it's more suitable for within-country studies. What are the main results? The main results is based on the main results are based on panel analysis with country and year fixed effects and a rather limited set of controls, essentially immigration stocks and per capita GDP. The results indicate that migration policy is not correlated with support for populist parties. And when it comes to the anti-immigration preferences, the findings indicate that, if anything, the presence of a negative correlation, there is a presence of a negative correlation with the openness of migration policies. More generally, there is very few other variables included in the analysis that appear to matter in explaining basically the dependent variables. And the main conclusion reached by the author is that there is no evidence of a migration policy backlash. So I think the paper is very interesting, timely, and is focusing on an important and understudied questions. The results are, I think, broadly plausible. I have basically three sets of comments. The first concerns the presentation of the results. The second, the potential presence of omitted variables. And the third, heterogeneous effects. So when it comes to the presentation, I would have liked to see a bit more detail on the data you are using, essentially, especially when it comes to the frequency of the data you are deploying. As far as I understood, the data are biannual for attitudes. I believe they are less frequent for election outcomes. And I would also have liked to see a bit more details in terms of the sample structure. I went to actually look at the paper by CAFE because I didn't know it. It's actually a very interesting paper. But as far as I understood from their analysis, their index on immigration attitudes starts only in 1989, 1990. So in reality, the sample is a little shorter than what's pointed out in the paper. The other point I would like to raise, I am an economist, okay? So that's why we like this. I think that's a slightly different way of presenting the structure of the paper. I would have liked to have seen the empirical equation you wanted to estimate written down in the paper. This would have helped the reader getting a better feeling of the empirical results. In this context, I think this is particularly important as the time structure of the data matters for the analysis, okay? So we want to know exactly when you're measuring policy, when you're measuring changes and levels, when you're measuring also the relevant outcome variables. So for example, you talk about national elections. Now from your presentation, I understood more clearly that this involves basically focusing on parliamentary elections, but this should be pointed out a little bit more clearly. Okay, so if, for example, I think about what happens in France, there I have a presidential election happening simultaneously with the parliamentary election, which kind of outcomes are used to pick up the extent to which the government is populist or not. Now, let's turn to omitted variables. So the analysis you present is very clean, is very simple, and I like that. And essentially what you're doing here is to control for country fixed effects to account for unobserved time in varying heterogeneity. On the other hand, you could still think that there are other time-varying drivers of both support for populist parties, aggregate attitudes towards migration, and immigration policies that could be considered. So, for example, you can think about economic determinants. For example, you can think about aggregate labor market outcomes that could vary across different countries. Something like unemployment rate, the tightness of the labor market. These are something which you could control for in your analysis to clean up potential confounding factors. You could also think about adding controls for characteristics of the immigrant population. So there are countries which are receiving more skilled immigrant populations. There, maybe the effects of liberalizing the policy could be different compared to those countries which have historically received less skilled populations. The other type of determinants you can think about are non-economic factors. For example, the ethnic diversity of the immigrant population. Again, this could matter in terms of thinking about policy backlash. We can also think about the geographic concentration of the immigrant population across regions. That might also be a factor that matters basically in explaining potential political backlash. And the last point concerns heterogeneity. As you mentioned in the conclusions, even migration policies focusing on the labor market, which are the one you are looking at in your study, could be very heterogeneous. So for example, almost all countries I know of have tried to liberalize migration policies towards the highly skilled. And those are very unlikely to give rise to a policy backlash. On the other hand, I think more open policies towards the less skilled workers could potentially be much more problematic from the point of view of a policy backlash. So if you could push more this distinction between this type of policies, that could be definitely something which would add value to the paper. Another type of policy which might be worth considering in this type of analysis are policies basically towards asylum seekers. Again, if you look at the recent rhetoric in the policy debate over the past few years, many populist parties have focused on fake asylum applicants in their anti-migration rhetoric. It would be nice to see basically whether the liberalization of policies towards asylum seekers would actually have an effect basically in terms of bringing back this anti-immigration backlash. Overall, I think it's a very interesting paper. I think you're opening up a very interesting set of questions, and I'm sure you can write many papers with this type of framework and this type of analysis. I really enjoyed it, and it was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Giovanni. Alex, would you like to tackle one or two questions very quickly?
Sure. Thank you, Giovanni. That was great feedback. Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. So the way I think about it now, and actually I had it on my last slide that I was gonna look at the heterogeneous effects of different policies. The way I think about it now, I kind of thought of it as like a short paper, which can then give rise to like other papers where I can look at heterogeneous effects of different policies, where I can look at heterogeneous effects of policies on different types of voters. So, you can also expect that like, pro-immigration policies can only impact those who already have anti-immigration preferences.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things you can look at, but since I kind of don't really see much stuff going on even in this kind of very simple analysis, I just thought just to make one simple argument, it might be sufficient. When it comes to the presentation of regression questions and results, I totally agree with that. I think it's more like a disciplinary difference. Political science don't always do it, sometimes we do it. I mean, I think I agree with you that in this case it can make sense. I can totally add that. It's totally fine. I don't know, I mean, I went into you can emphasize a few times that I only had a few controls. So I mean, I can totally add all these other things that I already have it. I mean, I can totally add that if it makes sense. I just also I'm not a huge fan of just like kitchen sink regression where you just like add the hundreds of controls just because somebody said it can possibly matter. I mean, I think that you have to think some of the things that you mentioned here. I think it kind of makes sense, like unemployment stuff. I mean, some other things like. I mean, so my worry about like including controls related to the characteristic of immigration population, they might have some kind of post-treatment bias. If a certain policy, is specifically like addressing certain issues, but I have to think about it more. But in the end of the day, I'm just gonna end up what reviewers are saying, I guess.
Okay.
Maybe just a quick question from Christian, and then.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. I'll be quick. I think we are running out of time, right? Just the question is, so what exactly means openness to migration? Since often you have more selection with openness. So you can be open to some groups of migrants and be more restricted towards others. So it's not so obvious that openness always means the same thing, or to the same people. I think Heinrich has some interesting discussions about this.
Yeah, I mean, so most of my research, and I encourage everyone to check out my website, focuses on exactly this question and like what is openness. And I mean, so my initial idea when I started doing this paper was exactly what Giovanni said, is that to see if people are much more open toward high-skilled immigration policies, which we know are like less controversial usually, as opposed to especially like asylum seeker kind of related policies. But I don't really see any effects in this particular context. But obviously, there's a lot of kind of research, across disciplines in terms of like people's immigration preferences. But I think most of it kind of, there seems to be some kind of general component, right? Whether it's related to general kind of ethnocentrism. So it's like you can always find people who are like open to high-skilled immigration, but not open to like culturally different immigration of low skills. But these things are very highly correlated. So I think it kind of makes sense to have kind of one simple index of immigration openness. But of course, I mean, I totally agree. You can always kind of disaggregate it as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. So now it's time to move to the presentation of the third paper by Christian. So Christian, the same rule, 20 minutes, and then the discussion by Eli. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so without further ado, without sake of time, so I'll start now. Thanks for the opportunity. It's a paper that it's joint work with David LeBlanc, who's also here with us today. Violence, Immigration, Demand, and the Boomerang of Deportation Policies. The paper first initially had a subtitle, was the Central American Migrant Caravan created in the US? So, which is, of course, a provocation, but not only. So we argue that there's at least some of the violence that we observe, not only in Central America and other countries, can be traced to immigration policies or deportation policies, more particularly, and that may create a new demand for, or more demand for migration. So the argument in a nutshell is, the argument in a nutshell is that the deportation of convicts, quite a straightforward argument, that the deportation of convicts from the United States leads to violence in the deportees' home countries, and this in turn can increase the demand for people from this country to seek entry into the United States. So the argument that most of the paper, which is an empirical paper, try to provide evidence at different levels of analysis to support this claim, this argument. So we apply two-step regressions to different levels of analysis. So we have a first step regression where we want to explain violence, homicides in migrant countries of origin as a result of the inflow of deported convicts. And then use predicted homicides to explain demand for migration. And we apply this regression to 3 levels of analysis. So we start with a cross-country analysis for Latin American countries for the years 2004 to 2015. And then we apply the similar logic to the case study of El Salvador and use subnational evidence at the municipality level and then individual level analysis too, right? So this is what we do in the paper. It also has a very clear motivation. Violence has been an important driver of migration trends. So we have the case of the Northern Triangle country, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, which with very high levels of violence. And well, case of the Central American gangs has been a lot in the press. That drive much of this violence. And these had their first appearances in the US actually in the 1980s, and you now find them across Central America. And much of this violence has been attributed to these gangs. At the same time, we have a strong increase of migration from Central America. We had a 10-fold increase of applications for asylum status in only a few years. There's a nice paper by Michael Clements who traces apprehensions of minors in the US to violence in their municipalities of origin. We had the migrant caravan in 2018, and many cite and surveys attacks and threats to their lives as a reason for leaving home. So when we have a lot of the debate on violence and migration is framed or seen from the perspective of destination countries. So we have Donald Trump talking about bad hombres that bring violence from the host country, etc. So, we don't engage much with this literature. So there's reason to believe that this is not the case, but we don't really engage with that literature. Rather, we make a change in perspective. So we look at these issues from the source country perspective, arguing that migrants flee violence that has previously been exported from the United States. There are a lot of anecdotes on the role of deported convicts for violence. So there are just two observations. The first one is from El Salvador, arguing that people who have been in the US and are sent back here return with all the bad habits they developed there. But it's not only El Salvador, not only Central America. So there's another example from the case of Jamaica, who says something very similar. So on their return to Jamaica, people link up with counterpart criminal elements to continue their legal activities from our shores. So what we want to do in this paper is to see if there is a systematic causal relationship between deportations, violence, and immigration. Can we see can we measure an effect beyond these anecdotes? And also, is there a systematic pattern beyond the case of Central America, which is the most well-known case? So 3 contributions of this paper. First, add to the discussion on drivers of immigration, understand the demand for immigration, and focus in particular on unauthorized migration. Get a causal estimate using an instrumental strategy in which we use the inflow of deported convicts as in a first step regression, and trace what we term a vicious migration boomerang of deportation policies that in turn leads to more migration. So start with the cross-country analysis. We had a strong increase of deportation in total. So we had more than 5 million deportees over this period. About 40% of these had been convicted for some felony in the United States, which also includes minor felonies, but we are not able to distinguish between what kind of felonies we are talking about. So 40% of these had some prior conviction in the US. We also have rising trend in immigration to the US. So this excludes, so these are 3 indicators: apprehensions at the US border, new arrivals, so all those who enter through the normal formal visa system, and asylum requests. This excludes Mexico because Mexico is such a strong outlier, in particular on apprehensions, that we prefer to exclude Mexico in the empirical analysis. Right. So these are, for the cross-country analysis, the 3 variables we are interested in, just showing a cross-sectional picture for the year 2015. So we have on the one side a correlation between homicide rates and the inflow of deported convicts, everything measured per 100,000 persons of the home country population. And we also have a correlation between homicide rates and asylum requests. So, and also, which is not shown here, a correlation between homicide rates and apprehensions at the US border. So of course, these are only correlation, and this is only a cross-sectional picture, a description of the variables, basically. So what we want to see, or we want to convince you in the paper, that there's also a causality at play here. So we run for the cross-country part a first-step regression in which we explain homicide rates in countries of origin as a result of the inflow of deported convicts, plus controls and time and year fixed effects, which is based on a different paper in which we add more details and instruments using migrants' exposure to state-level immigration policies, but this is basically a very similar setup than in the other papers. And then explain homicides, the predicted homicide rates. We use the predicted homicide rates to explain immigration demand 1 year later. So as a system of equation, we have the inflow of convicts in t = 0 to explain demand for entry in t = 2. Right? So what we see is that left deportation leads to higher homicide rates. So everything is per 100,000. So the inflow of 10 deported convicts, according to this regression, would lead to 1.6 or 1.7 increase in homicide rates per 100,000. We also use the alternatively change in deportation rate next to homicide rates in levels. So the key issue, of course, here is that really a causal effect of the inflow of deported convicts on homicide rates. So we run a few placebo regressions, which increase our confidence that we do indeed observe a causal effect here. So we don't see, it's noteworthy that we don't see an effect of the inflow of deported non-convicts, actually the leading values for non-convicts are negative, and we also do not see an effect of leading values of a change in the inflow of deported convicts. So it's really the lagged past values of deported convicts that explains homicide rates. And then in the second step regression, we use these predicted homicide rates to explain asylum application rates. And there's a strong positive effect of lagged homicide rates on an increase in asylum application rates, and the same is true for apprehensions at the US border. So we see a pattern at the cross-country level that is consistent with our argument that there's a deportation boomerang. Right? First increase in homicide rates, and this then translates into a higher demand for immigration. So the second part of the paper looks at the case study of El Salvador, which is an extreme case within the universe of countries we have. So it was in 2015 the most violent country, and it also had the highest rate of application for asylum, the highest rate of inflow of deported convicts, and a very high rate of asylum requests. So is El Salvador really here? Is El Salvador there for a spurious reason, or can we trace a mechanism that explains export of violence via deportations and, as a result, increase of immigration demand? El Salvador is a case that had high rates of out-migration since the 1980s during the Civil War, and then in the 1990s. Remittances contribute to 70% of GDP. And today, violence is an important driver of immigration. Much of it due to rivaling gangs who had made, as I said at the beginning, their first appearance in the US in the 1980s. It's also an interesting case because half of the Salvadorian diaspora is concentrated or was concentrated in poor urban districts. So half of the Salvadorian diaspora went basically to three places: Los Angeles, Washington, and Long Island, together with New York City. So what happened was that children of Salvadorian immigrants were socialized into existing gang cultures at destination and were then sent back. When they were older. So Carlos Doras summarized that nicely in a sentence when he says, "We sent them children fleeing war, and they returned gangs to a country that needed to construct peace." So what we do here in the first step model is we start with individual level analysis. So gangs perceived in surveys. So people are being asked, how much violence is there in your neighborhood? Is there presence of gangs? Do you feel unsafe? Using LAPOP data that cover 86 municipalities. So we have the difficulty that at the level of El Salvador, we cannot observe the inflow of deported convicts at a subnational level. So what we use instead as exposure to crime in the US, at the places where migrants lived. So we know the migration corridors from origin to destination, and then calculate for each municipality how exposed have migrants been to crime that existed before they arrived. And assuming that if they grew up in more violent places, they had a higher probability of receiving deportees later.
5 minutes, please.
Okay, thanks. So in the second step, the second step then uses the predicted perception of gangs to explain migration intentions. So here the question is, do you intend to immigrate to another country over the next 3 years? And again, using a two-step regression here. So in fact, people who live in municipalities whose migrants settled in places that used to be or that were violent in the 1980s have a much higher probability of responding positively to these questions. Have a higher probability of saying, yes, in my neighborhood, they are strongly affected by gangs, and I have been victim of crime, and I feel unsafe. And these are also the same people that then in the second step regression respond that they have higher intention to migrate. So here, this is ordinary least squares, so we can interpret this as the probability, comparing probabilities between the most exposed municipality to the least exposed municipality. So they have a much higher probability of having migration intention. And so the next step is, so we might have limitations of personal level analysis. So maybe intentions don't translate into actual immigration, and also not an objective indicator. So can we confirm the same at an aggregate municipality level? And here we use a policy experiment in 2012. So we can't easily measure gang violence at the level of municipality. So we use a truce that was brokered between rivaling gangs in 2012 that was negotiated in prison and lasted approximately 1 year. So we had a sudden drop in killings in March 2012 when the truce started. And we used that drop in killing to estimate the probable distribution of gangs at the level of municipalities. So we had a strong drop in violence and killings as a result of the truce. Probably gangs are more active in these municipalities. Right? This is not a perfect indicator, but it's as close as we can get to an estimation of the geographic presence of gangs, and use that as an indicator of gang violence. How much dropped violence as a result of the truce? And use the same instrument, exposure to pre-existing crime in the US in the first step regression, plus a lot of pre-treatment controls, etc. And then here in the second step regression, we estimate immigration intensity. So there's one survey, a Mexican survey that asked migrants. So it's basically migrants who are returned, who are deported, who are returned, and that are caught on the intent of migration. So there's a question of where was your last residence, so that this allows us to estimate exit from municipalities. It's not a measure of the exact rate, but it tells us about intensity of recent out migrations. And again, in the first step, we see that higher exposure to US violence leads to higher rates of gang-related killings, and more gang-related killings lead to higher immigration intensity. So what we are seeing as a summary is, so there are two main findings. On the one hand, violence generates a strong demand for immigration, and we find evidence for what we call the vicious migration boomerang. So the deportation of convicts generates violence, generates more migration. And we can see that at 3 levels of variation, at the cross-country level, as well as at the municipality level, and as the individual level. So there are, of course, important policy implications of this, of the huge indirect costs of deportations, and also that as a policy to deter migration is also ineffective and self-defeating. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. Thank you for staying within the time limit. So now I'm going to give the floor to Elie. Elie, we're fast to give your discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you go full screen? Because
Can you not? Okay. No. Sorry.
yes.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so let me start by saying that I really like the paper. I think it's a very important issue that you look at, Christian, and it's a very interesting paper. I think it's very important to shed lights on this vicious cycle of migration enforcement, violence, and new migration from the US and LAC countries. So basically, in a very nutshell, what this paper is doing is that it basically provides evidence that deportation of foreign-born convicts from the US increases crime rates in origin countries. And this in turn spurs higher demand for entry in the US as a response to, as a way to escape violence at the origin. And basically there is some empirical evidence that is provided to support this notion, this idea of a migration boomerang of deportation policies. So I have first I want to say that I think the framing of the paper, at least the way it is written, is for me a little bit problematic in the sense that the deportation of convicts is presented as an immigration policy, as a policy that is intended to desensitize new immigration, and that tends to be self-defeating. But I am not sure that the deportation of convicts is the immigration policy. I think it should be read, as Giovanni Perrin and Heinz said it, more as a crime policy, as a way to basically remove criminals from the US and so reduce local crime in the US. So I would read more this paper as a paper that documents the unintended side effect of a crime enforcement policy in the US, but not much as a self-defeating immigration policy. Yeah. So I also have a question about the contribution of the paper. So basically, as you said in the previous paper, in the a very nice recently published paper, you provide evidence of the negative externality of these deportation policies on crime rates at the origin. And so so the contribution of the paper is basically to say, okay, this increased violence at the origin leads to higher immigration. But this second leg basically is not entirely new in the literature, and as you acknowledge, it has been already evidence. So I know that you said in the presentation you don't want to engage with that question, but still I think that it could be interesting to look at the effect of deportation of convicts on local crime in the US, or at least to have something to say about it, since so it is related to my first comment that this is for me a crime policy, not so much an immigration policy. And for me, what would be a fascinating question would be to see whether there would be a trade-off between reducing crime locally in the US and increasing it at the origin. So and then you can think of many mechanisms at play. So of course, the removals of foreign criminals can have a deterrent effect. So it can reduce crime in the US. It can also displace crime in the US. So as you highlight in this paper, it can also increase violence at the origin, and so increase undocumented immigration, which, at least in the context of Europe, has been shown to increase crime. And I think of all this strand of literature that you probably should refer to somehow in the paper by Mastroboni and Pinotti and Francesco Fasani. And also, there is a huge strand of literature on return migration, on the fact that returnees bring a lot of skills and information and network back at the origin. And so in the case of criminals, it is interesting to see whether these criminals that bring connection to the US could also foster development of transnational organized crime. So maybe this is another paper. I let you decide. So now I have more technical comments on the analysis and the empirical analysis. So I think.
How many further comments do you have? Because we are running out of time.
Oh, okay. I have 2 slides mainly. Two slides.
But try to be synthetic, please.
Okay. So first, I will go for the main one basically. So I think that it will be very nice in the cross-country analysis to have a reduced form analysis where you basically quantify the predictive power of deportation in explaining demand for immigration in absolute terms, but also relative to other very well-known determinants of immigration, such as income differential or stuff like this. Okay. Also, in this analysis, you focused on the effect of violence on the total demand for immigration, but it would be nice to have something to say on the composition of the outflow, whether, the people that leave to escape violence, are they more likely to be less skilled or more undocumented or etc. and so forth. Then I have some comments on the case study. So I think the first stage when you regress the presence of gang or perception of gang, the exposure to US crime is a little bit problematic due to the self-selection of migrants. You can think that migrants that come from areas that are rife with gang activity will tend to select a destination with higher level of crime where they can basically use these criminal skills. And I'm not sure that your control variable are completely dealing with that issue. And in the second stage restriction, I think it's a little bit problematic also because basically you said that to cite you, it isn't likely that migrants' exposure to US violent crime affect immigration intensity other than the transmission of crime and other than via the inflow of deported convicts. Okay. But it could be that more violent U.S. counties could be also counties with higher economic growth and hence more opportunities for Salvadoran migrants. So, and I think that the size of your estimates are a little bit worrying because you find that the presence of gang increased migration intention by more than 40%, and that feeling unsafe increased migration intention by more than 60%. So considering that the average of migration intention is 38, you are like even above 100. So it's like huge effect. So it's this is something that is, in my opinion, a little bit worrying. So I have a last suggestion. I have a very last slide. Is that maybe instead of exposure to US crime, maybe what you could do is use exposure to the deportation enforcement policy in the US that, as you said, varies over time and across US states. So this will help to bring a closer connection with the first part of the paper, basically. That's.
Thank you, Elie. Maybe Christian, can you take maybe the main point, or what you consider as the main point raised by Elie, and because then we need to move to the last presentation. I want to be fair to the last presenter class. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. There are many points. Thanks a lot, Elie. So that's really helpful. Thanks. I think I would just take the other call. There are a lot of things that I think last point is a good idea. Actually, I have done it in other papers, but using the deportation risk. I think I haven't done that, but that's a great idea. So, yeah. So there's so many points. I think I couldn't pick just one. So maybe we just go to the questions, but thanks a lot.
Sure. No problem.
Yes, of course, you can interact with Elie afterwards, and I guess that
we do that.
Send you, some questions. So thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Okay, guys. So now we move to the last presentation from class. So class, can you upload your presentation screen, please?
Yes.
Okay, please go ahead.
Do you have my presentation in full screen mode?
It's coming. Not yet for me, but. So it says that we are starting to share content. So here we are.
Yeah,
Okay.
in full screen?
Yes, 20 minutes, please.
Yes, I hurry up. So thank you for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure. And yeah, I'm very passionate about this line of research, and I would be very interested in any kind of your comments. So please feel invited to also reach out to me after the conference. This is joint work with my former colleague, David Benczek, and our paper is titled Higher Economic Growth in Poor Countries, Lower Migration Flows to the OECD. Let's just jump right into it. Most of you are probably well aware of the so-called migration hump hypothesis, which is also called mobility transition theory or immigration life cycle, which is a theory that dates back to the 70s, stating that along the long-term development trajectory, immigration develops in an inverse U-shaped pattern. And many different drivers have been proposed to shape this relationship. Among them are demographic change, structural economic transformation that induces higher labor mobility, selective immigration barriers, network effects, and access to outside information, financial constraints, and some others. And all of these factors are, by one way or another, related to economic development in the long run. So this theory has gained some momentum since in 2010, Reiner Haas, and in 2014, Michael Clemens were the first to provide empirical evidence for this pattern at the global level. And since then, illustrations like this one here have been published in policy papers, and they are often accompanied by quite strong causal interpretations at the country level. And given the recent politicization of immigration and the fact that about 2/3 of the global population reside in countries left of this peak, such an interpretation has far-reaching implications. So from a rich destination country perspective, that implies a sensitive trade-off between supporting economic development and reducing immigration pressures. However, at its heart, at least this empirical pattern here, is merely a comparison between countries. So a more neutral interpretation could also be like, we observe the highest immigration rates in countries somewhere in the middle of the global income distribution. And then the question remains, if it's reasonable to assume that immigration will rise with economic development in Ethiopia because we observe high immigration in Portugal today. And the observed differences in immigration might then be due to the differences in income levels, but they might also be due to other factors. So for instance, geographic proximity and cultural relations to high income countries most likely lead to higher levels of development as well as to higher immigration. And the consequence is the validity of this causal interpretation depends to some extent on the existence or non-existence of systematic differences between countries. And in our paper, in the first part, we show that there are substantial differences. So in this table, we compare low-income countries with other non-OECD countries. And you can easily see that for the poorer countries at the increasing part of the migration hump, the average distance to the next OECD country is much, much further. Not a single of these countries shares a common border with an OECD country. They are less likely to have colonial ties to the OECD. They are about 3 times more likely to be landlocked, and they host much, much larger populations on average. And all these factors are likely to influence both economic development and migration negatively. So these systematic differences cast some doubt on the usefulness of cross-sectional methods to investigate the influence between economic development and immigration. And that's basically already the first part of the motivation for our paper. And besides that, we are specifically interested in the shorter term dynamics of this relationship and the role of individual incomes. So the major drivers that are proposed to contribute to this hump-shaped development migration nexus typically aim at the very long run and are only loosely related to individual incomes. Moreover, Michael Clemens and Hannah Postel demonstrate in their 2018 paper that the poorest quintile of countries might need another 200 years to reach the turning point. So what is crucial is, even if the observed cross-sectional pattern is rooted in a causal relationship at the country level, there's still the important empirical question whether and how short to medium-term dynamics deviate from this long-term relationship. And this is particularly important for practitioners and policymakers in order to assess the impact of development policies at reasonable time dimensions. And this practical and political relevance very much lies in high-income countries. It's OECD countries that provide the most development assistance and that receive the most migrants and that are currently most concerned with immigration. Which leads us to our research question, which is, how does economic growth in developing countries influence migration flows to the OECD? And to investigate this question, we rely on 35 years of annual net migration flows between 1980 and 2014 from 146 origin countries towards 16 OECD destinations. The data was compiled by Abern and Wesselbaum and is basically an updated or extended version of the data that Ortega and Peri used in their 2013. And the first task that we perform with this data is to reproduce this cross-sectional relationship. And you can see that for each of our decades, that works quite well. So in the cross-section, again, we have this hump-shaped relationship. And what we now do for our entire analysis is that we only focus on the countries at the upward sloping part of this migration hump. So we exclude any country that at any point in our observation period exceeds the threshold of $7,000 per capita. So that leaves us with a working sample of 54 poor countries below this threshold. And for these countries, we estimate the influence of economic growth on immigration using quite straightforward country fixed effects immigration model. And we decided to model the relationship in absolute terms, meaning that we regress the absolute number of immigrants on absolute GDP controlling for population. That has basically two reasons. The first is that that's how our migration data comes. And if it's not necessary, we didn't want to divide it by population and risk to induce a measurement error stemming from poor quality population data. And also we wanted to avoid to having population on both sides of the equation. And second, most likely population growth and its influence on or relationship to the age distribution of countries has an impact on immigration beyond just denominating GDP. And therefore we felt that this absolute setup would be cleaner. Our high magnitude variables are transformed using the inverse hyperbolic sine function, which is very, very similar to the log transformation, but comes with the benefit of being defined for zero. Another important issue is the way to incorporate changing feasibility of migration to the OECD over time. So technological progress, access to transportation, and immigration policy changes likely systematically affect the feasibility to migrate over time. And to account for that, we have two different approaches. Most traditionally, we use in most of our regressions time-fixed effects. And as an alternative, we also try to model this trend directly by including the number of global air passengers, and the average restrictiveness of immigration policies in our destination countries. And that brings us already to our core results. To the left, for comparison, we have the cross-sectional regression, and to the right, we have different variants of our panel estimations. And as you might have expected by now, when we control for the differences between countries and only focus on the relationship between economic progress and immigration within countries, the results look very different. So while the richer countries within our sample still have higher immigration rates, economic growth is consistently associated with less immigration at the country. And relying on annual data alone, like in these regressions, of course, risks that short-term shocks very much drive these relationships. So, for example, business cycle fluctuations might something that we pick up here. And for that reason, we also use household consumption data, and we also aggregate our data in 5 and 7 year time intervals to better account for a medium-term relationship. And that works quite well, and our negative coefficients survive. Naturally, we employ many other robustness checks using very different cutoff thresholds, other migration data, other GDP data. We interact GDP with the position in the cross-sectional hump to make use of our full set of countries. We use different specification and many other control variables. And that all works quite well, which gave us a good feeling about the robustness of our estimates. Nevertheless, some weeks ago, Michael Clemens criticized our empirical setup in his new discussion paper and also on Twitter, arguing that our approach would be flawed and that the negative correlation is largely spurious. He basically argues that GDP and population are both non-stationary variables, which is probably right, and having both of them in the same regression would create a special case of the Granger-Newbold spurious regression problem. And controlling for the non-stationary component of population would absorb the non-stationary component of GDP, which is economic development and which is what we would like to measure. And he offers also a way out. So to resolve this issue, he suggests to change our empirical setup and regress immigration rate on GDP per capita. I was quite surprised by this assessment because my understanding always was that in a panel setup like this one, where the number of countries is significantly larger than the number of time periods, non-stationarity wouldn't be that problematic. And also, we already had a setup with rates and GDP per capita in our appendix, and there our estimates survive as well. But in his paper, he also raises another point, and that is more general, not really targeted at our paper, but equally relevant. He argues that including time fixed effects could mask the true relationship between economic growth and immigration, since economic growth at the origin country level is significantly influenced by global developments. And I find it very, very difficult to assess these claims from a theoretical perspective, which is why we decided to design a Monte Carlo simulation to investigate how the different methods fare in different scenarios. So basically what we do here, and that's not part of the paper, we take the real GDP and population data that we use in our analysis and for the same countries, and then we simulate artificial migration flows as a function of GDP. The benefit of that is that the non-stationarity and the relationship between GDP and population that might create problems is in this simulation. And we use 4 different variants. First, we assume immigration rates to only depend on GDP per capita and some noise. Second, we additionally assume population growth to have a positive influence on immigration rates. Third, we assume a positive time trend in international migration. And fourth, we assume autocorrelation. And what we then do is for each of these scenarios, test if how the different methods fare and if they are able to retain the true beta. We set beta to be minus 0.5. Yeah, I have 2 more slides, I think. Which is roughly the estimate in our equations. And here are the results summarized in box plots. So the box plots indicate the mean and the 95% confidence interval for the GDP per capita estimates from the respective regressions. In the top left, we have the first case without any additional influence on immigration. And we see that the 4 different setups fare exactly the same. So I think that's good news for us, because what we don't see is that our absolute setup would have any problems in retaining the true coefficients, and also including time fixed effects here and here does not change that picture at all. Then when we move to the second scenario, first significant difference becomes apparent. So here we assume that population growth has an increasing effect on immigration. And while our setup, where we control for population, still regains the true beta, we have significant biases in the per capita specification. With time fixed effects, it's in downwards bias, and without time fixed effects, it's a significant upwards bias. In the third scenario, in the bottom left corner, we have the scenario where we assume a positive time trend in international migration, and with year fixed effects, both methods do fine, but without year fixed effects, both show a significant upwards bias. So excluding time fixed effects seems to be very problematic, and even more problematic in the per capita specification. That might also indicate that any non-parametrical setup that does not account for changes over time might come with biased estimates of the relationship between GDP per capita and immigration. And fourth, the scenario with autocorrelation. Here again, both methods are very similar, and it's the inclusion of time fixed effects that is important to regain unbiased estimates. So altogether, the simulation task based on the real GDP and population data does not suggest that our empirical specification is flawed or more likely to produce a spurious GDP estimate. I would argue rather the other way around. Is in some settings, the GDP per capita setup that produces biased results. And with that, we come to our conclusion. So in the short to medium term, we observe a consistent negative association between economic growth and migration to the OECD. And that is inconsistent with the cross-sectional results and with a narrow interpretation of the corresponding theory. The likely explanation for that is first, as demonstrated in the very beginning, that low and middle income countries differ systematically in crucial characteristics that are related to economic development and immigration. And any cross-sectional approach is therefore very likely to produce unreliable results. And second, with our 1 and 5 and 7 year time intervals, our GDP coefficient is likely to be mainly driven by changes in individual incomes and in economic prospects for the individuals. Other factors that are associated with development in the very long run, but not so much closely related to rising income, might still contribute to rising immigration over longer time periods. Yet our interpretation is that in the more policy relevant time periods of 5 to 10 years, economic growth rather discouraged people from migrating to the OECD, and hence policymakers shouldn't be too concerned about trade-offs between development cooperation and immigration. And since there have been some misinterpretations of our findings in the past weeks, I would also make briefly clear what we do not claim. So we don't claim that immigration declines in the future as long as there is economic growth. And we also don't claim that the migration hump hypothesis is disproved or debunked, since, as mentioned already, this theory very much depends on slow-moving factors that change over very long time horizons that are only indirectly related to economic growth in shorter time horizons. And that might not, is not the purpose of the paper to test that. So we are really more, our estimate much more covers the role of individual incomes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Klaas. Okay, maybe you can get rid of your presentation. Okay, thank you. So as a chairman, I'm going to give the floor to myself as a discussant now. I'm going to try to share the content screen. Okay. Screen. Okay, can you see my presentation? My discussion? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. It is a very interesting paper. I'm going to try to be short. This is, of course, a hot topic given the many analyses that are provided right now. So everyone saw Michael's presentation yesterday that was highly related to your presentation. So basically, your main message is that the hump-shaped relationship between immigration and development that is obtained in many empirical studies might be due to cross-sectional analysis, especially ignoring unobserved heterogeneity. So this is going to be solved by panel data models. And in the first part of the paper, you with also a good explanation of why unobserved heterogeneity has such an impact, because we can see strong differences between low and middle income countries in many observable determinants of immigration. And you said that you had a couple of robustness checks, but it is really an understatement because you have a huge amount of robustness check in the paper. So this part was really impressive because there is a lot of work in there. So my main points. The first thing is a little bit about the terminology in the paper. So you claim that by estimating panel data models with fixed effect, your estimates are causal. So the key question is it enough? And I'm not totally sure because there are still cross-country varying and time varying unobserved factors that can affect both immigration and income. So what I'm missing a little bit is a credible IV analysis. And of course, you are going to say, yeah, very, very easy comment, but which instrument? So I gave some thought, maybe discovery of natural resources, even though the exclusion restriction might not be correct, but maybe natural disasters could do the job to the extent that natural disasters are found not to lead to a lot of immigration. So I don't know, but basically maybe I would like to see if you have thought about that. My second comment is about this unilateral dimension. It's not that because I am a big fan of gravity models that I like the bilateral dimension, but I think that the bilateral dimension gives you much more information that is ignored by the unilateral dimension. So, for instance, let's take the example of Mexico. I am sure that basically the relationship for Mexico might be different for the same level of income, because Mexico has a particular place very close to the US, a huge border that is shared with the US, and so on and so on. And this cannot be properly captured by some unilateral information, but it's really the value added of using bilateral factors in gravity models. So I think that maybe your paper should be supplemented with some bilateral analysis. Then, okay, about the hump shape, even though in the last part of your presentation, you come some clarification about the fact that you do not try to show that the hump shape relationship is wrong, but still, I mean, this is the core message of your analysis. And I was thinking about that the hump shape might also be generated by other mechanisms than the classical trade-off between financial and liquidity constraints and opportunity cost. So first of all, if we get rid of out selection factors, and for instance, if you look at intentions, like the use of the Gallup data, you see that you have still a positive relationship. So it's not only so the positive relationship is not only due to the financial constraint, the liquidity constraints. And the second thing is that at the aggregate level, and this is something that has not been addressed so much in the literature, is the role of immigration policies. My feeling is that when a country is improving in terms of economic development, this country is going to be less subject to restrictive immigration policies set up by the main destination countries that are located in the OECD countries. And if you look, so here I just provide you a map of this strong correlation between restrictions that are faced by origin countries and level of development, so level of income, a strong negative relationship. So the darker the area, the more restrictive are the policies applied to this particular country, and you see that there is a significant negative correlation. I mean, developed countries are much less subject to restrictive immigration policies. So this could generate also this positive relationship between immigration and development. And so I wanted also to have your thought about that. But overall, it's an interesting paper, and it is a very exciting literature. And I see a lot of, as you said, debates and controversies in that literature. And this is something that I like very much. Yeah. Thank you. So, okay. Stop sharing. Stop sharing. Okay. So, class, maybe I can give you you can maybe take one of two comments that you would like to address.
Yeah, very briefly. Thank you very, very much for the feedback, first of all, and for the very concrete suggestions how we can improve the paper further, especially. So to be honest, we did not really think about an instrumental variable approach yet. We will give that some thought. With the gravity model, that was something that we thought a lot about in the beginning, because having these bilateral flows, of course, allows for a gravity model approach quite easily. We decided to stick with a more basic immigration model because we really were interested in this migration hump phenomenon, which in essence is a phenomenon at the origin country level, and it's about immigration and not about bilateral flows. And we did not want to complicate the analysis by that. But yeah, I think we give it a second thought and see if we should really introduce that. With respect to the Gallup data, on other projects, I also work with that data. And you're right that there is some indication that for positive selection on income, but there are also some some evidence that points in the direction of our findings. So one of the most influential variables, if we do a regression analysis with the Gallup data, is typically the question regarding the economic outlook for the individual. So a very, very strong positive effect on migration can be found when individuals expect negative economic change. And that goes much in line with our findings, where we see positive economic effects reducing migration probabilities. And with respect to the selective migration policies, I think that's an excellent point, and that's really also part of the motivation for our paper, because this theory for this hump-shaped pattern for long was mainly a theory, and many different factors were proposed that could contribute to that. And I feel in the past years, and especially in my discussions with policymakers, that now most assume that it's really only the role of incomes. And incomes always only have been one of many potential explanatory factors for that relationship. And especially if we think about development policies, then we need to have in mind what dimensions of development affect immigration and what dimensions of development we affect with development cooperation. If the hump is due to selective immigration policies or network effects and improving access to information, then we should just treat that as a given and not really give that much practical relevance for designing development policies. And that so it can still both be right that there is this hump-shaped relationship coming from these slow-moving factors, and at the same time, economic growth can still discourage people from moving. And better understanding the influence of these different dimensions of development, I feel is extremely important for future research and for our discussion with policymakers.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe just a quick question from Simone before we close the session, and I will have to say something on behalf of Chalar.
Oh, thanks, class, for a very nice presentation. I want to bounce back on the idea of using the dimension. The reason that I have in mind is the following. You just had a subset of destinations, 16 always destinations. So what you uncover might be a redirection effect. And what I have in mind is the following. Think about the regional dimension of economic growth. So for instance, all East Asian countries, the East Asian tigers were on a similar trajectory. So once you try to estimate the impact of GDP per capita or GDP in Malaysia on Malaysian immigration, you might be picking up the effect of growth in Singapore that attracted a lot of Malaysian migrants, possibly diverting them away from the 16 destinations that you are considering. So you have a subset of destination, and I think that these should be taken into account when interpreting your results, understanding what are the possible threats to which your results are exposed to. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So if I got that correctly, that regional economic development is very much related, and that when neighboring countries have high growth rates, then people immigrate there instead of going to the OECD countries, and that's something we wouldn't pick up. Yeah, that sounds very reasonable to me. I have to discuss that with my co-author again. We might want to include some regional fixed effects or something like that. We also do some robustness tests with other migration data where we have different destination countries as well. So that might also be something that we should look at more systematically.
Okay, thank you very much. My boss is calling me, and we need to stop here otherwise. So two small messages. So the next session will start at 5:30 European time, 11:30 US time, so in 20 minutes. And Chalar wants to remind you that it's a different web link. So you need to activate a different link, not this one. This one will be that in a few minutes. Okay, thank you very much for this very nice session. And okay, see you in the next session, guys. Bye-bye.